This is basically EduCore. We're here to talk about classroom management, and we're moving from classroom management to classroom community. My name is Andre Beard, and I'm here with Professor Theresa Stone, and she's going to be the person that I'm basically conversing and having this dialogue with. So when we think of classroom community, what I'm trying to talk about is how we can move from the normality that we have today of suspending students and expelling students to getting a classroom community where everyone's engaged and involved and feel accepted. What do you think of when you think of classroom management, Professor Stone? Like, what are some ideas that trickle when I say classroom management?
Yeah, I think when I think of classroom management, the word management really brings up this kind of image of work, of workers being managed and made sure that they're doing the tasks that they're supposed to do. It's a very hierarchical relationship, right? Someone's in charge, some other people have to listen, usually have to be quiet. Um, and my experience is being taught how to manage a classroom. We're very much based in a punishment model, as far as, okay, these are the rules. If you don't follow it, you get a warning. Then you get like timeout, basically, like you get pulled aside. Then you get a call home. Then you get a referral, right? It's very much um, about making sure everyone is conforming to this very narrow view of acceptable behavior in the classroom.
And I really do appreciate that response. When you said management following rules, following orders, behavior, reward, and punishment, I think of when I think of classroom management, an assembly line where we all have a part that we have to do to make this industry continue. But
Mhm.
when we think of an assembly line, the teacher is the authority, the dictator. We all play a position, whether it's for the better of America or not is still to be decided. But what I'm saying is because we are in a way robots to this industry, to this monopoly, this scheme, those conditions aren't something that humans should just, give into. Those are not conditions we should live under. And that's what I think of when I think of classroom management, building robots to fill the machine to work and only work,
Mhm.
but not to think, not to change. Um, so yeah, did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I like the way you put that. So yeah.
The next thing that they all correlate, and when we think of suspension, I'm thinking of a control system. When you were in school, I don't know if you, I'm pretty sure you do remember, like what were disciplining policies? What was it like to be in school as a student, getting disciplined and watching other people be disciplined if you were?
Hmm. Yeah. So I grew up in the East Bay in Pittsburgh. It's a city that it's called Pittsburgh because it's another steel town. That's where a lot of the jobs were, continue to be, although some of those industries have shut down. Um, and most of the people in Pittsburgh were not white. So when I was in high school, the high school population was about a quarter Black, a quarter Latino, mostly Mexican and Chicano, although some people from Central America, and about a quarter Asian, mostly Filipino, Vietnamese, Pacific Islander, and then about a quarter white. And a lot of those folks were from the Italian families who had come in, also with a lot of the Black families during World War II. And so this was a city that was often looked down upon in comparison to the more white, small suburban cities around it. Um, when I would talk to people my age from outside who live somewhere else, they'd be like, oh, do people stab each other at your school? Um,
The stereotypes. You
stereotype.
from Compton drive-bys, you know.
Yeah. So being from a family who, like, my dad is white, my mom is Mexican, both of them were the first in their family to go to college. So I was really one of the more privileged students, and I didn't get punished. I didn't get singled out for punishment very often. Um, but it did happen on occasion, and it was always, um, this kind of like mark on you, this kind of like you did something wrong, you stood out of line, and you observed really in some ways, even if I wasn't personally singled out for punishment, it was made very clear by the ways that my peers were, the ways you would be treated if you were not conforming to the expectations. And I was quiet and more shy. And so, there are a lot of reasons why I wasn't the one who's experiencing a lot of that. Did I answer
Yeah,
your question?
it did. Because I was about when you were talking, I wrote a question that
Mhm.
tied into it, saying how was diversity in school or lack thereof, how did that affected you? I believe you did answer that by saying you were the only child in your condition, like you weren't necessarily you were privileged, but there were other people around you, and then the stereotypes of where you go to school. But it's like my parents. You said your parents did go to college, correct?
They did. They started at a community college, Antelope Valley College, which is in Palmdale, Lancaster. It's like the high desert area north, a couple hours north of LA. There's a lot of poverty there. A lot of people who were there were brought by the war industries, Northam, trying to remember their names, Boeing, these companies that make war machines.
Okay, okay.
So they started there and they transferred to Long Beach State, and graduated from there. Although, part of my like perspective and part of the ways that I bring my family into this is because there are generational lessons that we have to learn about classroom management, right? Like my mom, when she's a Chicana, this was like the late 1960s. She's out of community college. Um, and she dropped out for a little bit because she was like, I don't know if this is for me. And when she tried to go back, the counselor is like, yeah, I guess I'll re-enroll you, but I don't know why, because you're not going to transfer anyway.
Mm.
um, right, which is an experience that is common still for a lot of people, right, to get that kind of feedback on their potential. um, and so, there are a lot of different ways that these ideas of who belongs really shape the ways that typical or normative classroom management are carried out.
Yeah, and when you say that, what I'm writing is, I agree with everything you're saying. The reason it was hard for me in particular to follow the rules, I went to so many different elementary schools. I think I went to 6 different elementary schools, and that's for every year. So when we talk about following the rules, I had to learn the difficulty of I live here, we act like this. This is cool. I go here, I can't act like this. Because it's all subjective, it's all cultural, it's all community. So when we think of these rules and exiting out students who don't qualify the script that we want to write for them, it's like I just came from another school where this is appropriate, and so you're telling me now I'm in the wrong. So we have to ask ourselves: Is that whole community that behave like that wrong?
Mhm.
And that's a whole. We can have that conversation, but let's have that conversation and not target that one individual.
Exactly. Mhm.
And so yeah, when we talk about disciplining, we're really talking about why suspensions don't work. And you gave a great illustration of classroom management, the guidelines and procedures, like what's their intended effect. Why do we kick students out and like abandon them? And we all know the generic answer is to protect the safety of the learning environment. If the learning environment is hindered, then all kids won't learn. There's no point to come to school. So my other question was, if there was any disciplinary action, did those work at your school?
Um, did they work? I mean, it depends on what they were meant to do, right? Getting back to what you were just talking about. Um, I mean, I was one of those kids in the honors and AP classes, and I remember the ways that conformity was demanded of some of my peers, especially male peers of color. Take your hat off.
Yeah.
Why do I have to take my hat off? But it enforced in such a way, not like what does a hat have to do with like can we all learn? I can learn
Right.
with the hat on, I can learn with the hat off. I'm not blocking anyone's view. Um, but it was more about submission, right? Like, am I going to submit to this arbitrary rule, which has been decided is for some reason going to interfere with the learning community? But really, it's about, as you said, cultural values, and whose values determine and shape the classroom, and who judges whether or not people are conforming to the values that are expected, right? And so in that way, exactly like you said, right, we can say whole cultures are wrong by the way that
Right.
we come up with, like, what is learning? What does learning look like? We all have to be quiet. We all have to have our hands still, right? Like, that doesn't come naturally to everyone, right?
Especially kids. Go
Right.
on. Yeah.
I don't think comes naturally to anyone, right? But there's some people, right, which a lot of like going way back, research and education says, like, school culture lines up with white middle class culture, um, and that is specific, but it's universalized into a norm, and then it's as if there's something good inherently, about those particular ways of acting in the classroom.
Right, which has possibly nothing to do with the learning environment. If anything, it could just be a way you were brought up. And I say that because most of the teachers, majority of teachers, people who become teachers are white females, statistically. So they have the control of what the behavior is going to be like in the classroom,
Mhm.
which is important. I went to because they get nitty gritty. I went to I didn't go, but there's a school called Clovis where you don't have to believe like they're not targeting specific people. These are just the rules of the community for the students. I'm like, there's a school called Clovis near Fresno where you have to cut your hair. Everybody, if you're a man, not females, but if you're a man, you can't have a beard and you have to cut your hair low. So I would be, this is not in dress code the way I look. And I was turning 18 when I found this out because I was deciding whether I wanted to go to this school or another one. And when someone told me that at the office, some student, I was like, that's kind of extreme. What does that have to do? It's like, no, it's for appropriate attire. And if you can't be conform to the appropriate way of dressing, then you shouldn't come to the school. You're a rebel. You're all these things that you're not, just
Mhm.
because they want you to look a certain way.
Mhm.
So that brings me to my next point. I got expelled, and you could say it was justified because of the way I behaved. If there is ever a justified means of suspending a student, so what does the troublemaker look like? You know, who is the ideal student?
Mhm. And going, adding back to what you're talking about, the idea of appropriateness, right? Who comes appropriate ready to the classroom already, right? In all the places and ways that Black hairstyles are demonized and deemed inappropriate, from the way that people's hair grow out of their head, right? Like,
Right.
like, this is how I show up in the world, right? Like that is clearly, right, a measure to exclude. And it's meant to exclude, it's meant to be a justification for exclusion, right? Because people, it's no longer like, okay, most places come out and say, okay, no, we're not going to allow Black students at our schools. But,
If you
right,
don't cut your hair.
if you're not going to
Hmm.
conform, right, if you're not going to show that you are willing to conform to these white supremacist conceptions of appropriateness, then kicking you out is justified, right? Saying that you're in violation is justified. And these, yes, it is a new form of Jim Crow, right? It's a colorblind, quote unquote, way, to continue with the same kind of sorting mechanisms, that started with these like biological ideas about race. Those are like debunked, contested. So then we have these like cultural, ways of expressing racism, these ways that we can name things that are associated with culture, um, But because so many people have bought into this idea of appropriateness, all of a sudden, and professionalism, same thing, then we have people who can be excluded based on these, again, arbitrary white supremacist ideas about appropriateness and professionalism.
Right. And I like that you said all that, because I think when we talk about hair specifically, or any type of way it could be tattoos. Well, it could be anything that limits a person's autonomy. I believe that I'm referring to. But
Mhm.
you're right, because you can't say we don't want these certain people to be here. All we have to do is make up rules for how we live to make sure you know this is how we live, and if you don't abide by those customs,
Mhm.
maybe it is fair for you to leave. And that's another thing I wanted to mention, like
Mhm.
just being pushed, because that's a new form of racism to me. Like
Mhm.
pushing people out of the neighborhood or pushing people out of the school so they don't have a chance to be welcome in it.
Mhm. And you were talking about Clovis, right? And that's the more wealthy white city near Fresno, right? Is that
Yeah.
I'm not from the area, but I've heard about it.
Yeah, it's like a version of where we are right now, basically in Fresno. Yeah.
Mhm.
Which is a good conversation for my next slide. I have just a couple of different questions, no real question, but ideally, when we were looking at the ideal student, are these what troublemakers look like? Do we classify these people as troublemakers? As far as like students that we're trying to craft, what are some ideals that these people fall for in our society,
Mhm.
are in society, and are these not the students we're trying to create and mold? And if not, who are we trying to mold into our students?
Mhm. Yeah,
So yeah.
yeah, definitely. These are people with powerful visions for society, right? Who have really powerful critiques and understandings of the ways that systems work together to form hierarchy and to justify dehumanization, dispossession, and death, right? They have these incredible critiques and incredible ways that they have um, carried out movements, right? Ways of thinking, ways of sharing and creating communities, creating knowledge within communities, um, so that we are, not always working from this white supremacist capitalist hierarchy in our ways of thinking, right? They provide alternative worldviews and means to get there, right? Some of them are more the vision makers, some of them are more the path makers, right? Some of them just traveled that path. Um, but I can't imagine, right, the idea of like classroom management, right?
Not
Uh,
here.
no, right? And then
This
we
is like
also
a church house.
right. And we also have to think about who that we see here was excluded from education, right? We can think about schooling as a place where education happens sometimes, right? But what kind of education is it is then the question. And then we also have the potential for liberatory education, which is why schooling was kept from Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, and then continued into many of these people's lifetimes in segregated and super under-resourced, de-resourced schools.
Right. When we talk about education, Fred Hammond saying revolution is education, and like one thing I noticed about all these people, you were right, they did have education taken from them, and they needed that education to be the revolutionary that they became. But something that is interesting is these are rule breakers.
Mhm.
But did they not break the rules in their time to uplift us in societies that we view today? Like it's because they broke the rules that we live a better life today.
Mhm.
So what does it mean to break the rules? And who are you breaking the rules for? You know?
Exactly. Mhm.
Hold on. The next important discussion that I wanted to talk about, I just wanted to look at this quote. I hope you can, yeah, just give me a while. I do want to read this quote. I love reading it and saying it out loud.
Mhm.
This quote comes from James Baldwin in an interview where he's talking about education like he always does. I'm a phenomenal man. Everyone should look up and know. But he basically says the paradox of education is precisely this, that one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he is being educated. The purpose of education, finally, is to create a person, is to create in that person the ability to look at the world for himself, to make his own decisions, to say for himself, this is black or this is white, to decide for himself whether there is a God in heaven or not. But no society really is really anxious to have that kind of person around. What society really ideally want is sinistry, which simply obey the rules of society. The obligation of anyone is to examine society and to try to change it and to fight for it. And no matter what risk, this is the only hope society has. This is the only way society changes. And again, one thing that I wanted to mention is this sinistry, citizen citizenry, sorry, the obligation that we want to just obey rules to conform to society in order to change it. And one thing that I take from this quote is just it's easier to settle than to change. And I believe I mentioned this to you, like when it really comes down to changing in your, you know, your job is on the line or you're losing money, you don't get the stadium that you want for this school. Like when it really comes down to changing, getting your hands dirty, how many people want to do that? What do you think of when you see this quote?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's right. We have to think about the ways that so many people's lives are structured to be disposable, right? We think about this so many people right now in Tejas and Texas who are um, literally losing their lives because the infrastructure was privatized. There was um, no like keeping it up, right?
There was no plan.
There's no plan, right? So there are these choices for profit, and they're literally those choices are now costing people's lives, right? And so many of the areas that are most affected are the poor, Black and Brown communities and areas of the state. Um, so when we think about um, the idea of disposability, um, what I'm saying is that people are asked to choose between conformity, right? Be conforming to these rules. I will follow the rules, even though many times they're anti-Black, they are anti-Indigenous, and they normalize that. And so there's this conformity that people are pushed into to try to not be disposable, right? Because
Right.
if okay, so I'm not going to conform, like fuck that. I'm not going to like take my hat off. I'm not going to do this or that. But then do I get the diploma? Do I get an undergraduate degree? Right? All the ways that these pathways are connected, which in some cases, right? Not even all cases, right? There's this like idea that um, certain levels of education will equate certain qualities of life, right? But there's this kind of I don't know if it's a dichotomy, but it's there are choices between choosing conformity or kind of being relegated to disposability that are built into our futures, right? And so I think that when we think about schooling in that way, we see the ways that classrooms are organized and that learning, like how do we get people to learn? Well, do we have to force people to learn? Do we have to punish people into learning the things that we're teaching? Well, why is that? What are we teaching? How are we doing it? um, yeah.
There's a lot there that you stated. As far as one thing I wrote, there's this conformity to obey instead of breaking the rules, like we're talking about. But like in a way, double standard. And it's I'm thinking of the giver, where if you do something bad in society, you can be released as a punishment.
Mhm.
So like it's I don't want to be bad. Like I'm not racist type of situation that we're living. That's what I'm talking about with conformity. Like I voted for Donald Trump, or I know people who voted for Donald Trump, but I'm not racist, but I support Trump. The double standard that I can have it both ways. I'm not a bad person. I
Mhm.
think if you support a person with bad ideologies and you can benefit off those ideologies for your family, that doesn't mean you don't profit off of a new Jim Crow, new racism. And
Exactly.
one thing that I was trying to remember when you were speaking is new critical race theory. Hold on, is that what it's called? Critical race theory. Basically, how there is this when we talk about teaching equitably, how that because I was looking online, there was someone saying that they don't want to teach critical race theory because it's like wrong. It's racist to teach it, and I was like, well, the ideology that there is these benefits, and you're talking about teaching equitably. Even when you look at literature, how there's more predominantly white characters, or how you could teach To Kill a Mockingbird, but there's the white trope, the white man help the black dude, that always happens. So
Mhm.
even that is critical race theory, saying there's benefits in culture, society that uplifts the culture,
Mhm.
spiritually, mentally, and lowers another one.
Mhm.
And that's something that I was thinking of when I thought of that quote. The person being molded to create change needs to exist, but can't because of those structures and those things that you were elaborating. We I don't believe we mold black leaders or black and brown leaders or people to want to be president or to be something special. Um, and it could be a threat. I don't know the real reason, but I don't think we mold that reality.
Yeah. Well, I think you brought up or pointed to something really important, right? When you were talking about those people who are trying to say like the double standard of, oh well, I voted for Trump, but I'm not racist, that kind of thing. Um, and that really gets to something that's important that comes from, and that I don't want to say comes from, but right, that is central to critical race theory and teaching. And that is understanding racism as structural instead of like individual or interpersonal,
Yeah.
right? Like, so if I vote for a person who is dispossessing people with every policy choice that's made, I voted for death. I voted for that, right? And trying to say, well, I'm a nice person, right? I have like two friends who aren't white or something, right? Then that is not that is nothing. Okay, yes, that hurts, right? Yes, those kinds of comments are painful and whatever, right? When that interpersonal like thing happens, right? Like saying racial epithets, right? Those things are dehumanizing, demeaning, and like degrading, right? All those things. um, but as long as we support the structures, right? As long as people are voting and approving gerrymandering, right? Which continues to keep the vote of Black people primarily, right? That's largely how it's been used, disenfranchised. Then you voted for racism, right? If you're voting, for someone who has said we're going to separate families at the border, you were voting for that violence, right? We already
Exactly.
knew. That was clear. There's no surprise, right? There's no surprise. I talked to a teacher and he's talking about this idea of fact versus opinion. And he asks his students, is Donald Trump racist? And they all say fact. And he's like, well, no, that's just a well substantiated opinion, but he hasn't come out and said it.
A well substantiated opinion. Them was good words.
Right. Good words to gaslight his students. Right.
It's all good rhetoric. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And, like hearing that made me really angry and really um, upset to think about the ways that people will bend over backwards to try and justify these like death choices that are made, right? Like these ways that they're like, oh no, young children, like young people, you don't know, I know, I'm the teacher, right? It's right, it's a real abuse of that conformity, right? That like that idea in the classroom that the teacher has like the ultimate say of what's right and wrong, right? That the teacher writes the test and says this is the information you have to know. um Even if it's
All arbitrary.
right, if it's information that is like young people know at their core, that's wrong. Like didn't you just hear what he said about like my family members? Like didn't you just hear what he said about people who look like me? Right? Like
Are the policies that pit people in actual life cages. So it's like he's saying it, but his actual policies are like that too. I
mhm,
wrote, if you behave in racism, are you a racist? Because that's kind of like what we're talking about, where
mhm, mhm,
you can behave as a racist, but it's so, what is a racist? How do you define that? What does it take? What are the steps? What are the levels? If we sit here talking about that, then we can't call no one racist because it's always an opinion. So you can do some dirty things to people, but you won't be racist. If you're
exactly.
black, you can be a thug. Thug. The same thing applies. A double standard. You get me? And so I like that you mentioned that because that's all community. That's all classroom management. I was going to go into the slides about suspension, but we did, I think, good talking about suspension and why we need to look at a new way to govern our classrooms.
Mhm.
One thing, I had a video with James Baldwin. I'll probably show that later, but we can actually get into just the community building part. Let me share my screen.
Mhm.
Hold on. Let me see. Give me just a moment. I don't know why I keep forgetting where this is.
I can never find it myself.
I'm
Always
like,
lost.
So when we talk about community building, we were basically talking about the different kinds of knowledge that there are, and that's important to talk about as far as building curriculum unit plans. It's best to see how we structure our knowledge and our information to our students so we can best support them. And I do take this serious, not just like in practice saying it, but actually doing it for our classrooms. It's easy for me to see it done in the English class than to see it in the math class and the science class. I can see little glimpse of it,
Mhm.
but as a whole, it does make sense for us as a like school unit to do this together collectively to know the knowledges that we need to give to students.
Mhm. Mhm. Right.
So
I think can I add something there? I mean, I mean, I've taught English, right? Like I'm a professor in the English department. Um, but when we think about math, right, there's been like a lot of talk about like, oh, like now we're learning this new way of solving problems. And like kids bring their work home and parents don't know how to help them. um, but it's kind of this like shift back and forth between one way or the other way of thinking about math and solving problems, when really there are a lot of different ways, right? And what if we just let students know and practice those different ways, right? Because I think it's really tied to these their white supremacist ideals of that there's one way, right? There's one way to do things. There's one way that's correct. There's one answer, right? And so it's this legacy, right, of like individualism, and this kind of like ultimate being who has all of the authority. Um, and then also, right, we were talking with Jennifer the other day, and she was talking about social justice math, right? And that she was like, wow, we can do this. Like, I love this. And so there, I think there are some really like amazing and good things we can do and take up in like different subject areas. But so often we don't experience those, right? So often we're told, oh, there's only one way to solve this problem, or, oh, you didn't show your work and you didn't do it the way I told you, so it's wrong, right?
mhm.
Um, and so that's really reproducing this worldview that there's only one way, that we can only be one way, right? There's only appropriateness and only professionalism, right? All other ways are wrong, or they can only exist outside of school spaces.
Right, and you're very correct when you say it takes, like, I think it takes that student to have that done to them, where it's like this is all wrong or this isn't the correct way to do it. It takes those students to have that done to be like, there's got to be another way that we can possibly think of this. One thing that I love when we think of knowledge and the different types of knowledge, one thing that I wanted to mention was like I try to think of them as adding them all together in one plan,
Mm-hmm.
and it's easy to give my own example as far as giving definitions to what the different type of knowledges are.
Mm-hmm.
Having a pedagogical knowledge be the tool that you need. That's probably going to be the structure of your actual class, the quadratic formula, the tools you use in math. These are actually the structures that you have in your classroom.
Mm-hmm.
Using popular knowledge would be using hip hop, things that they know, to influence that into your curriculum. That could be a website. There's this website called Booklet that history classes can use to warm up their class. Me
Mm-hmm.
and my me and my mentor teachers just used this today to warm up a chapter one review for our class.
Nice.
Yeah, so it could be a website. It could be something that is there, like the music.
Mm-hmm.
When we think of mainstream knowledge, and again, these are for your actual students, like breaking the knowledge down when you write your curriculum or unit plan.
Mm-hmm.
A definition of mainstream knowledge would be like the idea of the school to prison pipeline. And I did see that there is difference between a transformative knowledge and a mainstream knowledge. Let me hold on, because I want to give you the exact thing that I read. Having the mainstream knowledge be the theories that we have, like the school, the prison pipeline is a theory that we hold to be true, that we're still establishing. And I say it's mainstream because it probably was popularized later in the 80s, but it's something that we hold still today, that the school itself is sending students in a passive aggressive way to the prison pipeline, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So my mainstream knowledge, what was it again? It was the school to prison pipeline. So if I were to do my own unit plan, I would be using the giver as a cultural reference. I would be using grammar so we can write our essays and our ideas down. We would listen to music to engage students in different ways than just reading the text.
Mm-hmm.
I could introduce to them the school to prison pipeline as an idea for how it works in our society and how it plays into the giver. Being released from society, being suspended correlates to the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I would use critical race theory to talk about how in the giver, the society is like ours, masking itself as a perfect utopia, but having dystopian values within its society that cast people out.
Mm-hmm.
So it's using these different knowledges of your students, whether they're Black, Asian, come from the Middle Eastern societies, and how you can utilize these five different knowledges to build a unit and lesson plan according to your students' diversity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then to get a little bit more at some of those critical race perspectives, um, Damien Sojourner has theorized the school to prison pipeline, not even like a pipeline where there's a school and like, okay, here's a nice school, but then you get sent into a pipeline afterwards, but the school itself as an enclosure, right? The school itself as this limiting and sorting um, space, right? I think we could think about that with like the giver too, right? You had to act a certain way there in order to not be sent out, right? So there's already an enclosure. There's already a limitation, and he talks about that, looking at the ways that I believe it was the early 1970s that cops were brought into classrooms to teach civics classes in LA to limit Black radical thought, right? To put an enclosure on the proper expressions of what does it mean to make society better. Well, we can make society better. We can vote, we can join the PTA, we can like join the school board or run for mayor or maybe even for president. But there's a limitation to that because that's all working within the systems that already exist, and systems that many people have already pointed out that are working the ways that they're supposed to, right? So we're enclosed within those systems. And so the limitation of thought, right, is saying, well, maybe these systems aren't the ones, right?
Right.
Mhm.
What I'm gonna do is play a video based on everything that you're explaining. And it is a James Baldwin video, the James Baldwin quote. Give me just a moment. I thought I had it ready. But I think this quote talking about education, and we all know James Baldwin passed away, but this is something he said around the time he was fighting, and it's so prevalent today, especially the end. So give me just a moment to share my screen. You hear me?
Yep.
Education in America, especially with respect to blacks, and especially why on this university the black enrollment very low. I don't know if he can really respond to that or not, but just go ahead.
I'll do my best. I'll be given the public school situation, which I know more about. And it's a very difficult question to answer too. It's a difficult answer because first of all, you can't begin to answer without feeling terribly futile. And look, the truth is, it's very hard to talk about education in this country without talking about the whole society in which it mainly fails to occur. You can hardly talk about schools, without talking about cities. And the cities are in the hands of financiers. The cities are in the hands of pirates, thugs. And our children, therefore, are victims of this, are victims of the principles according to which the country is run. The country is not run according to either the will of its citizens, I hope, or the good of its citizens, I know that, but for profit, for money, to make money. And education is $1 billion industry. And the least important part of that industry is the child. I think this is a criminal, but this is the way it works. Now, the public education in the city in which I grew up, is enough to break the heart, enough to make you want to kill. And when we have tried, and we're trying again, and we've tried over and over and over again, to educate our children ourselves, to be responsible for the teaching, the curriculum, for the books. We did that for 3 years in New York some years ago, and the experiment succeeded for 3 years. And because it succeeded, it was crashed, it was smashed by the Board of Education, the Teachers Union, and Albany. So that is what you're up against. Yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. That's what one's up against. As for enrollment at this college, let's face it, Black people in this country have a terrible time just getting through 24 hours a day. It's absolutely true, And education, it's hard to talk about education in a country in which literacy is adored. It's hard to talk about education in a country where people take seriously such a creature as John Wayne and Ronald Reagan. It is. It's true, And for a Black person to get an education in this country, he's got to have a lot of guts, first of all, and to endure. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but this institution is like many other institutions, and which means it's a racist institution.
Amen.
There's no way around that. All the American institutions are racist. And to get an education under those circumstances is a tremendous act of the will. And also you risk schizophrenia.
The reason I played that video, I think it's important. When you mentioned Damien, basically, he was giving the breakdown of the history of cops coming to break down radical thought. But if we know that it's for profit, where we're going to live in certain communities and X certain communities out, if certain teachers are here for to break that radical thought, that plays into the system, and it also makes sense that it's like that because it's for profit.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Right. And um, Black thinkers like James Baldwin um, have been saying this for a long time, right? This is not new, and yet it's restated and restated because um, there's a choice that people make to not listen and acknowledge, right? So we have so much beautiful and powerful work that does this critique, and we also have so much beautiful and power work that does the work of imagining and also creating alternative systems, right? Baldwin there talks about this experiment in Albany and then the way it was destroyed, right? And we have current educational thinkers like Bettina Love, right, who's talking about abolitionist teaching and the ways that at center should be ideas of Black joy, should be like creating educational spaces that honor who we already are, right? And this isn't meant in a sense of like there's no understanding of harm, right? This is understanding that harm happens, and that harm happens largely out of conditions that facilitate harm, right? And so this kind of teaching is coming from the place of deep understandings of society and the ways that the structures and structuring of poverty and want um, and and lack, right, when it comes to like material economic well-being and resources, right, and having what we need just to live, um, and understanding that all of those things have to change, right? The answers are not, they're not in the schoolroom, right? We can't just change school and society will be okay because the problems are endemic, they're everywhere. But right, we can teach our students how to engage both in the work of critique and also to engage in the visioning and enacting work of creating these spaces where we take care of ourselves, right? And again, this is drawing from Black radical, Black feminist thought um, that has had to find a way, right? So this is not me talking, this is me amplifying so much of this thought that is there um, and has already spoken these truths.
Right, right. And man, I was just listening to you. Sorry. As far as like what we can do to make these things better, because you're right. It is like structural as far as what we need to change. And like to end, I was thinking one way we can better the situation is to like there are different ways to learn, and we just have to learn how students learn so we can order our classroom in a way that best fits them. I'm not gonna go over because there are different. I just want to give people a different definition of how you students can learn. The one that I want to focus on is humanistic learning theory because this is the one that's like least practical, and it just basically says you're motivating and giving. You're not basing your grading on a scale of 0 to 100. There is no like there are assessments and improvements for the children, but there isn't a scale that leaves you hindered where you can fail or you're not the student we think you are. It's just to bring out the best qualities of the kids. The reason I say it's not practical is because you can't do that for every class because you have to measure the students and what they're learning. But I think humanistic learning theory, as far as a practice for a classroom where students don't have to worry about failing, they're just coming to class to learn a skill, to learn a new way to behave, but
Mhm.
not necessarily being judged upon that learning ability.
Mhm.
Yeah, what do
I,
you
I,
think?
yeah, I agree with you, but I want to push back a little bit. Like, do we have to measure?
That's true.
Right? Do we really have to measure? Because these measurements are used to create and operate ranking systems, right?
Hierarchies.
Hierarchies that are about who deserves what. And they're based on, um, right, like Eurocentric white supremacist ideas of excellence, um, and particular norms that, and even just the idea of like, as a teacher, oh, what do you mean like all your students have like A's and B's? Oh, you're going too easily, right? Like
Yeah.
you have to fail people, right? That's literally like how people think, right? Oh, if I'm not failing some people, then I didn't grade hard enough, right? There's the ways that rigor gets attached to punishment. Right, I don't give A's.
Like, what does that mean? So
What
you
does that
don't want
mean?
students to excel?
Right, right. Um, yeah, like you're never good enough is another way of thinking about that. I am the master of this content and you are not, right? Like, um, yeah, like when we start to think about these conventional ways of thinking about grading, right? That's also a form of management, right? When teachers are like, right, I talked to someone who was a department chair at a high school, and she was talking about the ways that she had these arguments with teachers who didn't want to give students passing grades because they had come to class tardy on a number of occasions. But the thing is that they had done all the work and, enough work to get an A, done the tests, all this. But the thing was that for that teacher, it wasn't about the content, or rather, the content was about, did you conform to these standards?
Principle of society.
Yeah.
That's
Uh,
what you're being graded. That's sad.
right. Are you learning to show up to work on time? Right. And right, we can argue about, oh, it's disruptive to have people come in late and, da da da. But, why? Sometimes we have reasons like, can we get to school on time or not? Right. But also, if it's in the middle of the day, well, why don't they want to get to your class on time? Right. And
That's real.
but also, right, this idea of on time, right? That's a very like culturally based idea. Like, what does it mean to show up somewhere on time, right? I understand commitments, I understand all of this, but right, so much of these things that we like totally take for granted are based really on very like narrow and very specific cultural views that have been universalized again, and been made for us to think of as the only way of showing up in life.
Right.
And I keep saying appropriately, I want to say real quick that this is drawing from the work of Nelson Flores and Jonathan Rosa, who write about appropriateness in language and these standards of language that supposedly, if only multilingual and Black and anyone really who's racialized, any students who are racialized, their language practices, if only they speak appropriately, then they will be accepted. But that is not true, right? Like
It's
it doesn't
not.
actually work that way. So the argument for appropriateness is again for these like ideas of conformity, and their argument is that conformity does not save us.
Right. And I like that you said that. If I do X, Y, and Z, this is something I think all because it's not a minority thing. It's just it's a human thing where if I do X, Y, Z, I'll be accepted. Where it's like that. That's not true. You can do whatever you want. Some people might just not like you. Um, I also like how you gave the position of the teacher, and this is something I was trying to mention earlier. I teach you, you listen to me, because I'm the teacher, the lecturer.
Mhm.
Make me, don't make you. And what I mean by that is make it interesting. Like, why don't they want to show up to your class? What are you doing that's not cutting it? You know? And that's something that we have to do that's revolutionary as far as teachers. Don't make it to where students have to come to this, like it's their job or responsibility to come to this class, even though it's boring to them, because that's torture. Like torture, it's not fair on their behalf that they have to learn from you and you can't make it interesting because it's not, you're not doing it both ways.
Right. But beyond boring or not, right, there's also like dehumanizing, right? Like,
Right.
right. I mean, yes, we want it to be interesting. Like, yes, we want to be engaged, but at the same time, like, do I want to go to a class and hear about like how my ancestors were
That's
like, right? From these frames that are all deficit frames, right? Like
that's true.
that doesn't make me want to learn with you, right? I want to learn about like the deficiency of my ancestors or like my neighbors or people that I care about. Like, no, I don't want to learn that.
That's real. You hit another note because I that you have to have want to have the stomach to be in those environments too because they're uncomfortable and people will make jokes. So yeah, I like that you said that. That's true too. Uh, I guess the last thing I wanted to mention, well, is we're gonna have the FAFSA review
Hmm.
um, next time, February 25th, from 12 to 1. So be there. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. We're looking forward to providing more conversations, more chances to think about schooling and education within these deep social and historical contexts, to think about the ways that we frame learning as things that really do shape our worlds, right? The things that we become accustomed to or even okay with. There's a lot of socialization into that in the schooling experiences that we have, and so much of that is harmful to us and to our communities. So we really want to interrogate what it means to be an educator and what it means to work in schools, um, because there's a lot of beauty and possibility there, as much as there's so much that's wrong. And so we want to think about these ideas together, right? Because it's together and in community that we can really understand one another's experiences. We can understand more um, about how we can use schooling spaces in humanizing and culturally sustaining and revitalizing ways. Um, and, you know, work together to really support our young people as they come up in this world. So thank you, everyone.
And hold on. And it's mainly because the kids are the future. So we appreciate you listening in and checking in on this episode.
All right.